What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Fed Up Church. I'm Pastor Sean Finney, and this week we're digging into Ecclesiastes chapter 12. Finally, we've made it. We've made it to the end. We get to see what Solomon had said throughout his entire life and what answers he came up with. The conclusion of the whole matter. So, don't care what translation you use, but I'm going to use the ESV, the English Standard Version, on this chapter. And again, I've said it many times. Whatever translation you choose to use, I don't care. It does not matter. There's no such thing as a perfect translation to begin with. Use the one you're comfortable with. The best translation is the one you're going to read. So freaking read it, blow the dust off, and let's dig in. Let's roll. Welcome back. All right, guys, check this out. I was at Walmart earlier today and found this sweet shirt. Strike first, strike hard, no mercy. Cobra Kai. Loving it. Anyway, has nothing to do with this chapter, but it's awesome. So anyway, where were we? We were in chapter 12. So Ecclesiastes chapter 12. Now, up to this point, we've asked many questions, right? Solomon has asked many questions. And among those questions are not necessarily does God exist, right? He's preaching to a bunch of agnostics. Literally, Ecclesiastes translates as preacher, or teacher, as we'll see going through this chapter. Now, all that being said, he has asked the questions and pretty much implied, does God exist, but does he matter? Does he matter in our lives? And Solomon lived. He was granted this gift of wisdom. He asked for a discerning heart to be able to tell the difference between right and wrong, to better lead God's people. God's answer to that was wisdom. And that happened early on. Now, understanding that, he still went on to live his life trying to gain a knowledge and an understanding of everything. Everything. You can think of it, this preacher did it. So, and that's King Solomon. He gets to the end of his life and he pens down Ecclesiastes. And we're finally at the concluding chapter where he's going to answer what's the point of everything? What's the point of this life that we're given? Why does he keep saying vanity of vanities? All is vain, right? Everything's worthless and useless and meaningless, and none of it is what we would seek to fill our lives with. Like, even if we succeed in filling our life with all the stuff, he says it's still pointless, it's still meaningless. Why? And that leads us to this chapter. And we'll see exactly what Solomon was saying all along. So, chapter 1, again, I'm reading from the English Standard Version. You read with you follow along with whatever you're comfortable with. And I'll pick up in verse 1. It says, "Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come, and the years draw near of which you will say, I have no pleasure in them." This is the first point, the first time Solomon has mentioned the Creator. Up to this point, he hasn't. And he specifically has not called God the Creator. But he's ending this book, Ecclesiastes, which is him preaching to a bunch of agnostic people that just don't really care. Yeah, there's a God, but I don't care. It has no impact on my life, doesn't mean anything to me. And he says, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. Why, Solomon? You didn't. Wisest man who ever lived. How did he get wise? And what does wisdom mean, right? So let's touch on that for a second. To say that he's the wisest man who ever lived is not to say he's the smartest man who ever lived. Far from it. Wisdom is simply the application of knowledge, right? So the smartest man would be the one who has all the knowledge, the most knowledge. The wisest man is the one who applies the most knowledge in the right way. Solomon is saying, based on his experience, and remember, Solomon had many varied experiences. And he's saying, based on all of his experiences, he's come to one conclusion. Remember your Creator. Getting tongue-tied. Getting the gift. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth. before the evil days come. Before the evil days come. What could that possibly mean? Well, if you remember from what we had, kind of the word study we've done up to this point, all the words that we misuse and misappropriate and just completely twist in today's culture, words like evil, that word does not mean sinful. There's a difference. There's a difference between evil and sin. And if you don't believe me, again, read through the Minor Prophets and see how many times it refers to God as bringing evil upon, wicked people. Evil means harm. And that's all it means. Harm, harmful. So he's saying, remember your Creator before the harmful days come, because they're coming. That bad days happen to everyone. And as we'll see in this chapter, even more so, the more days you have. So he's saying, remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near, of which you'll say, I have no pleasure in them. I have no pleasure in these years. When did Solomon write this? Right. Towards the end of his life. He was an old man when he wrote this. And he is saying you're going to come to a point where you don't have the youthful vigor that you once did. You don't have the passions and energy that you once did. And in saying that, he's like, remember your Creator during those youthful years when you have the energy, when you have the chance to not screw it up yet. Like he did, right? And we like to put Solomon on like a pedestal a lot of times, going, oh, wise words. He wrote all of like the Proverbs, Song of Solomon, and Ecclesiastes. But we got to remember who he was. Solomon was the king of Israel. He does hold the title, wisest man who ever lived, and he was a man of science, and we still refer back to a lot of the work that he did today. But he also screwed up. Big. A lot. Hard. I mean, how else do you gain all the wisdom, and how do you get to a point of being able to exercise good judgment unless you've made a lot of bad judgments along the way? And he's saying before you have a chance to get to the point where you screw it up, especially like I have done, remember your Creator. Now, he goes on saying in verse 2, before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened and the clouds return after the rain. What? He's going to launch into basically a poem about age at this point. And he's saying all of this, each one of these verses, the idea is remember your Creator in your youth before X, Y, and Z happen. And he's going to list these things. And he's saying before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened. Well, how does that happen? How do you get to a point where the sun and the moon and the light and the stars are dark? He's not referring to death, because he's referring to old age. And if you think about it, that makes sense. As you age, as you get older, you tend to have a dimmer sense of vision. The sun's not as bright. The stars are dim. You can't see them nearly as well. Vision's one of the senses that tends to go first. Now, we have corrective lenses now, right? And that helps a little bit. We have cataract surgery and we have all of that kind of stuff. But even still, that doesn't permanently fix everything. You can get laser eye surgery. And they sell it off like it's permanent, and it's not permanent. You have to have it done like every 10 years because your eyes still age. What does he mean when he says, before the clouds return after the rain? And we're getting into the most metaphorical chapter. The symbolism in this chapter is everything. In this kind of colloquial phrase, what we would call a colloquialism, this phrase, before the clouds return after the rain. Sunshine represents happy days, right? He even said it in the last chapter. It's pleasant to be in the sun. It's pleasant for the eyes to behold the sun. But there is coming a time in every one of our lives where it's going to be darker. And we talked about that in the last chapter about being afraid of the dark, not being comfortable with what we can't see, and the unknown, what's coming that we can't see. Everyone's afraid of the dark. But he goes on here saying the clouds return after the rain. You're coming to a point in your life where you're going to face a storm, right? That's common even today. We refer to tough times as like weathering the storm, or if it's everything's going smooth, it's the calm before the storm, right? But he goes on further here saying, yeah, but there's going to come a point where the dark days stay darker. And then you go through a storm and the clouds return immediately after it's already rained. It's getting ready to rain again. It's one ailment and one sickness, one disease or illness or problem or complaint after another, after another, after another. That's old age. That's what it's going to look like. And I mean, he would know, right? Because he's an old man at this point. But he goes on saying, like, you're going to get to a point where it's going to be more difficult for you to remember your Creator there at that point than it is in your youth. So remember your God, your Creator. Remember, He is your Creator, therefore He is your Lord, right? He has ownership. Have that reverence, that respect for Him in your youth, when everything that's on your mind is passions and pursuing dreams and making your imprint on the world and leaving something behind and creating a legacy. All the dreams of, young 20-somethings before they get jaded and they still have the sparkle in their eye. It's like, yeah, you're going to get to a point where it gets so bad and you wake up to everything. I saw a meme. I lost it. I thought it was perfect last week. And it was like, me when I'm like 18, fall off the roof. I'm okay. I'm fine. Shake it off. Me at like 34, I slept in the bed wrong and just kill me now. Just kill me now. The pain is not worth it. As you age, ailments start to happen a lot more frequently. Problems happen with a regularity and a consistency that, yeah, you feel like you're going through a storm right now because of whatever illness you're facing. But as soon as that one passes, the clouds are already back and it's getting ready to rain a different problem. That's the perks of living a long life, I guess. You get to experience all the many tragedies. But he's saying, remember your Creator in your youth before that happens. In verse 3, he says, in the day when the keepers of the house tremble. The day when the keepers of the house tremble. I'm going to read through... Hush, doggy. I'm going to read through this entire little section here, and then we're going to break it apart line by line and see what he's saying. So he says in verse 3, in the day when the keepers of the house tremble, and the strong men are bent, and the grinders cease because they are few, and those who look through the windows are dimmed, and the doors on the street are shut, when the sound of the grinding is low, and one rises up at the sound of a bird, and all the daughters of song are brought low. This is a metaphor for what the body goes through in age. And remember, he was the wisest man who ever lived, so you got to think a little bit deeper to understand what he's saying here. But if you understand that in the day when the keepers of the house tremble, what are the keepers of the house? And remember, what's the house? It's your body, right? This is the vessel that we are housed in during our life. And he's saying the keepers of the house tremble. The hands, right? Because these are the hands that keep your body, that protect you, that you can sustain yourself with. Like, it's very difficult to live life without your hands. And there are many people who do. But I doubt they would ever say, oh, it was a cakewalk. It's difficult. Before the keepers of the house tremble, and the strong men are bent. Well, the strong men are bent. It's literally referring to your legs. Your legs are the strong men that carry the house. This verbiage was used a couple of times, and it was used again in Psalms previously when David wrote it. It literally is talking about the legs of man, right? And that God takes no pleasure in them, in the legs of men, because they run to and fro, right? No consistency. But in our old age, strong men are bent, right? The idea is like your knees give out, man. You're creaking. You're getting older. It happens. This is my favorite part of this verse right here, when he says, "And the grinders cease because they are few." The grinders. It's your teeth. Your teeth grind, right? You grind your food. If you're like me and you're stressing out, they grind in your sleep too. But in your old age, the grinding ceases because there are a few of them left. They've rotted out or they've been yanked out, right? Because they cause pain. Most people get to their old age and don't have their original teeth, right? Like their adult teeth. You make it to old age with your teeth, props. That's awesome. You're already like a step ahead of me because I've had like wisdom teeth cut out and other teeth, and it just doesn't help that I hate the dentists. If you're a dentist, I'm sorry. I don't like you. Unless I have pain, and then you're a necessary evil, a necessary harm. But he says, because the grinders cease because they are few. And then he goes on saying, and those who look through the windows are dimmed. Those who look through the windows. Remember, the stars and the lights and the moon and the sun are darker. He says, and those who look through the windows are dim. The windows to the soul are the eyes. This is true even back then. It was true when Shakespeare wrote it. It's true today. We refer to the windows as like the eyes as like the windows to the soul. But he's saying those who look through the windows are dim. Previously, he was talking about your vision gets blurred and dimmed and darkened. But who are those that look through the windows? These are your loved ones, right? So people who would be able to get close enough to look into your eyes, to look at you and try to, are you still there? And even they're dim. You can't see. It makes it very difficult to remember your Creator when you're facing ailment after ailment after ailment. In verse 4, he says, the doors on the street are shut. And the doors on the street are shut. What do we think the street is? And why are the doors shut? Right? The highway by which we communicate with each other. Like I'm doing right now. Right? If I didn't have teeth, that's the highway. Now, I say things that come out to you. How do they enter your house? Through your ears, right? So your ears are the doors by which spoken words impact you. And he's saying, the doors to the street are shut, right? They're hard of hearing. Hearing goes. Even more so, I think this is even on a deeper level. Say you make it to old age and you still have your hearing. That's fantastic. But most old men I know, their ears are shut. Doesn't matter. You're not going to convince them otherwise. They are stubborn old men or old women. Age has a way of solidifying us into it, where we're not open to hearing other ideas, other perspectives. And he's like, remember your Creator before the doors shut and you no longer are willing to be taught. You're no longer willing to learn. At some point, we shut the doors. Even if God hasn't, right? Even if we still have our hearing and our faculties, there comes a point where we shut the doors. And this happens, and it's not even isolated to old age. We're seeing it more and more among people who are younger, right? They've shut the doors. They're not willing to entertain a counter argument, a perspective other than their own. And I've said this many times, you can't reason somebody out of a position that they haven't reasoned themselves into. So a lot of times it's no point in trying to debate or argue with some people because the doors are shut. They're not going to listen anymore. They have given up on logic and reason, and they have chosen their stance not based on logic and reason, so you're not going to be able to logic and reason them out of it. I see this as the case with a lot of scientists, a lot of people in academia who, choose to believe there is no God, right? They're just atheists. That's fine. You do you, boo. I'm not going to try to convince you otherwise if you're not going to listen. And you can tell right away when the doors are shut. There's no point. This is what the Bible refers to. Don't cast your pearls before swine, right? Don't waste your time investing words of wisdom and trying to educate and teach somebody who's not willing to receive it and is not, therefore, worthy to receive it. Don't waste your time arguing with idiots. It's basically what he's saying. This is a life lesson that Solomon has learned is don't waste your time on idiots. Now, he says that the doors of the street are shut and the sound of the grinding is low. The sound of the grinding is low. The grinders were your teeth. So what's the sound of the grinding? This is also referring back to the majority of the work that they would have done back then too, right? Which is like mill work, grinding grain and stuff like that. And he's like, even that, you could be right next to it. That gets dim because in old age, it's just that sound is low. You're struggling to understand. You're struggling to see. You're struggling to even feed yourself because your hands are shaking and you don't have many teeth left. And this is when most people say, I will think about God later. That's what they have in mind. You're not going to be thinking about God. You're going to be thinking about what you can eat and can't eat because your stomach can't handle this anymore and you can't chew this because you don't have teeth. And what was that? Huh? Can't hear you. And I can't even see you. You're not... Remember your Creator in your youth while you still have the chance. Because there's going to come a time when it gets much more difficult. And this is why the Bible also says today is the day of salvation, right? Don't put it off. Make the decision while you're young and allow God to influence your decisions and the life that you lead while you're still young. And maybe you won't be so beat up and battered when you get to old age. Right? Solomon lived every one of these experiences. I'm sure he was fully paying the price in old age, right? If you run a car hard, no oil change, redline it, and just drive it nonstop, it's going to break down. The body is no different. And the Bible, everyone looks at it, and I've heard this argument before. Well, the Bible is like this set of rules that, I have to follow, and I'm not going to deal with that. I'm not going to put that on my life. That's not part of my journey. Okay, no. It's not a set of just rules and regulations. Okay, if I buy an iPhone, right, from Apple, there's a terms of service agreement that nobody ever reads, right? Sounds familiar. It's kind of like the Bible. It's the terms of service agreement. Nobody ever reads. And it'll list what to do, what you can and what you shouldn't do and what you can't do, right? And if you do these things, you can't hold the manufacturer responsible when it breaks. If I try to use my iPhone as a hammer and, put some new decking on with it, it's not going to last very long. It's going to break and shatter and it's not going to be pretty. But I used it in a way the manufacturer didn't intend. So whose fault is it? Whose fault is it that you didn't read the terms of service or apply common sense, right? The same thing is with our bodies. We're given a body and then we're given a book that kind of lists, if you want to get the best experience out of this thing, this gift called life, here are some instructions. Here are some guidelines to operate within. It's not a set of rules and regulations. And if you think about it and you go back through, if you study the Bible, you'll find that the majority of things that it commands not to do, we know today not to do. because it causes disease, it causes illness, it spreads germs, it does this and that, right? Like, you probably shouldn't go around having many partners. Nope. And if you ask the CDC, the same exact thing. Like, how do I avoid contracting HIV? Well, don't have many partners. HPV. How do I avoid HPV as a young college-aged woman? Don't have many partners, right? So the idea of like having one partner for life kind of avoids all of that. Just saying, it's a good idea. And there's not a physician on the planet that would tell you otherwise. It's wise advice. That's what the Bible is, through and through, is a set of standards, expectations, guidelines, parameters to operate within if you want to get the best experience out of life. If you use it outside of those guidelines, does the world end? Oh, no. I've known many people, many Christian people, who operate way outside of these guidelines all the time. And yes, is that missing the mark? Is that sin? Yeah, sure. Is it causing havoc in their life? Maybe, sometimes, not all the time. Most of the time, they're just living normal life. So no. Does it impact them? Does it affect their quality of life? Yes. In every case, yeah, in one way or another, and you can always kind of trace it back. And people look at you like, oh, you're just crazy, you're just old-fashioned, and yeah, I am, because what was written and given by the manufacturer, remember your creator, it was good advice, and it makes sense. Probably lost half the people on this podcast just by saying that, they're off. But he says, when one rises up at the sound of a bird, how many old people sleep a sound, good night's sleep, good night's rest? They don't. So it's interesting, and if you're talking about like the neuroscience behind it, right? It's my specialty, it's my field. The neurobiology behind it, when you're young, you're an infant, right? You sleep in short bursts because you don't have the capacity. At that point, your brain is not going to allow you to go into many REM cycles and deep layers and levels of sleep. There's really no point. The purpose of sleep is to reconcile a lot of the memories, do a lot of what we call neuron pruning, eliminate the neurons that are, because you start off with a ton more than you need, ton more brain cells than you need. And as you make these memories and these connections are formed, those are solidified during sleep, and then the other ones are pruned away, right? And then as you get a little bit older, sleep becomes more necessary to repair damage in the body, to solidify the things you've learned, because you've had a lot more vast experiences throughout the average day as an older person, like an adult or even a teenager, than you would as a young child, toddler, preschool kid. And then as you get older, it reverts back. And why do we think that would happen? If the whole purpose of sleep is to repair damage in the body, well, the old people are getting a ton of damage in their body, right? Their body has become a lot more ineffective at repairing things. That's why cancer is so prevalent in older age, right? Because those are cellular mutations that the body didn't catch, because mutations happen all the time. And your body is great at identifying them, destroying them, and moving on. But as you age, it gets less efficient at doing that. And some, slip through the cracks, and those ones grow, and those cause tumors, right? Cellular division that just runs amok. So there's definitely a need for more sleep, but if the primary reason that we sleep is to give the brain rest and to organize what we've learned, to solidify those neural pathways, as you age and your memory starts to slip, because like Alzheimer's, you get a lot of the tau proteins that build up on these neural sheaths, there's no point. There's no real new memories being formed. So it's a struggle, and it becomes harder for people to get a good night's sleep when they're waking up every 2 hours. And Solomon is saying, you're going to get to a point where you'll rise at the sound of a bird. You're not going to get a good night's sleep. Everything disturbs you. And if you look at your grandparents, great-grandparents, anyone you know that's elderly in your life, and what time do they wake up? And we think like, oh, it must have been a generational thing, right? Because they're old and they wake up at like 3 a.m. It's not. It's really not. Because anyone's like over the age of like 60 starts to get into kind of this routine of, the birds are crowing and they're waking up. There's really no point in sleeping. It's a struggle. It's hard. It's exhausting to try to sleep. And he's saying, yeah, you're going to get to a point where even birdsong wakes you up. But then he goes on saying that you'll rise up at the sound of a bird and all the daughters of song are brought low. The daughters of song. This could be referring to the birds, right? Like you'll wake up at the sound of a bird, but you can barely hear them anyway. So you don't even get any pleasure in that. But also, this is also referring to like when you refer to somebody as the son of something or the daughter of something that it was somebody who was fully that thing, right? The sons of Baal were people who worshipped Baal 100%. If I was to say like, I'm a carpenter's son, then that means that's part of my identity, right? Like I am a carpenter. I'm not a carpenter. But you get the point. The same thing applied when it was talking about women too, right? Daughters of song. So even these people who had wonderful voices their entire lives will get to a point where they can't even hit the notes they used to hit. They'll wake up at the sound of a bird, but they themselves, daughters of song, can't even really sing the way they used to anymore. They've lost that pleasure along the way too because of age. In verse 5, he says, they are afraid also of what is high. Literally, they're afraid of heights. I already have that. Man, that hit me at like 20, 22. I don't do heights. I got past the point, and part of me thinks that it was like, I'll just claim it as like an emotional maturity thing. Because there's a time period where you're like, yeah, I got to prove I'm tough. And I'll eat all the spiciest possible food, and I'll go to the highest heights and ride the scariest roller coasters because I'm trying to impress somebody. That lasted maybe a couple of years, and I was like, forget this, man. This is too much. Like, this is giving me anxiety. I can't do it. I don't do spicy foods. I don't do scary movies. I'm a Finding Nemo kind of guy. And I don't do heights. No, I don't like it. I look down, my knees start shaking. I tried climbing a ladder a couple years back to replace a light bulb on my house, and it's like 30 feet in the air. I made it like halfway, and I'm shaking so much the ladder's bouncing off of the wall. I'm done. We're not playing this game anymore. So you say, but that's literally what he's saying is like, as people age, yeah, they start to get more afraid of heights because a fall when you're 20 from any height, 5 feet, 6 feet, you could kind of shake that off. A fall from 5 or 6 feet at 80, you can break a hip. That's life-threatening. And no, because the bones are more fragile. So you become a lot more cautious of everything. They're afraid of what's high, and terrors are in the way. Literally in the roads. Terrors are in the roads. More so now if you're old and still driving. But they're afraid of everything. Everything in the streets, everything. They have no desire to really go out and about because it's dangerous. And you get to a point when you're getting old, you got to be more cautious because you're not going to heal like you used to. And most people realize this. So why remember your creator when you're young? One, you're more reckless. You're more willing to take on risks, bigger rewards. But when you're older, you're more cautious about everything. You don't really want to go out. You don't really want to take any risks at all because you're trying to preserve your life as much as possible, as long as possible. So that becomes the focus, not on remembering your creator. So he continues on in verse 5 saying, the almond tree blossoms. Almond trees, they blossom white. So the almond tree blossoms. My almond tree's starting to blossom already. I'm getting some grays up in there. Getting some grays here, right? He's like, yeah, there comes a point where the almond tree blossoms and you weren't expecting it because almond trees blossom before anything else. So you don't even think it's ready. It's the season for these things to start blossoming, right? And then all of a sudden you're like looking in the mirror going, what? Where'd that come from? Where'd they all come from? They're everywhere. The almond tree just blossoms and takes every one of us by surprise when it starts. And for some people, it starts a lot younger. I started getting grays in my mid 20s. More so now that I've hit my mid 30s. Definitely getting a lot more grays. That's why we consider grays a sign of wisdom. It's a symbol. Oh, it makes you look more wise, more refined, more educated. Nope, it just makes you look silver. Solomon continues on saying the grasshopper drags itself along. The grasshopper drags itself along. This translates differently in other verses. Let me grab one. All right, so for this one, I'm actually going to pivot over to the New King James because this is one verse I think the ESV kind of missed the point on it. Because, it's kind of hard to translate when you don't really understand it. Right? If you're thinking about it, the grasshopper drags itself along. What it's trying to say is the grasshopper becomes a hindrance, which doesn't make any sense unless you remember the culture. So what was John the Baptist's food, right? Because if you're thinking old age, you don't have teeth, many teeth, they're few. You're not eating a lot of meat, that's hard to chew. So you have to eat things that are a lot easier to get down to digest. And John the Baptist, his meat, his food, was locusts, what we call locusts, right? But literally translates grasshopper, locust, same thing, same word. The New King James Version says, verse 5, and they are afraid of heights and of terrors in the way. When the almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper is a burden. The grasshopper is a burden. So even these things that they would eat, culturally, they would eat grasshoppers and locusts and things like that because they couldn't digest the meat. They couldn't chew it. And if your big chunks of meat don't digest well, right, you have to be able to chew it. So if you can't chew it, then you're eating grasshoppers. And there comes a point in your old age when even that's a bit too spicy for you. And that becomes a burden. That becomes something that's difficult to deal with. Number one, who wants to eat them, right? That just doesn't sound appetizing. I doubt it really sounded appetizing back then. This is why they did locusts and honey, cover it in sugar. Everything's better with sugar. But at the same time, it's a burden. Eating the same thing all the time is a burden. And even that isn't easy on the stomach. So he's saying that, there comes a point where the grasshopper becomes a burden. Even the thing you would eat when you can't eat anything else becomes hard. And he goes on saying, and desire fails. What do we think it means by desire fails? Because if you think about it, when you're young, you're full of desire, full of desires and passions and what you're interested in, who you're interested in, and what you desire, what you want. He's saying, you get to a point in your old age where what you're eating is difficult. You're so consumed with all these ailments and your body failing that even desire fails. You have no desires to really achieve anything else, and you don't really have any desires towards anyone else. So you get to be a grumpy old man, lonely and alone, right? Just desire fails. So even that sense that, if you don't have all your mental faculties, that makes sense. It's going to be much more difficult for you to focus on anyone else other than yourself and what's failing. So desire fails. And he says, because it says, for man is going to his eternal home. Now we're coming to it. We're getting to the conclusion of everything. What was the point? He had said before, the grave is darkness and just Sheol, right? We talked about that, where it's just an empty abyss. They didn't really have an understanding of the afterlife until Jesus came and explained a lot of it. But he's saying man is going to his eternal home. Eternal home. It's the first time we see Solomon pointing to an eternity we have to even think about, right? Because that's what his audience never thought about. Like culturally, in Israel at the time, nobody cared. Like an afterlife, what? They didn't really have any idea of it, so they just didn't really care. It's not affecting me today. It's not affecting me right now. Don't need to worry about it. They were worried about everything being in the here and now, the present. What is it going to affect my life right now? This is why they got so tripped up in idolatry all the time and worshiping all these false gods. Because the idea was, with a lot of these pagan gods, one, you needed to know the name of it. If you knew the name of it, then you can control it, you can command that god. Makes no sense. Not much of a god if you can control it. But you would grab a hold of that, and wherever you took it, you maintained the power of whatever it was, because they all had their own jurisdiction, so to speak, and their own power. One was like the god of fertility, one was like the god of crops, in agriculture. You'd have one that was like the god of healing, one that was god of fortune, and whichever one it was, you would grab that little trinket and you would carry it with you wherever you wanted to go. But, here's a big but, they had boundaries. Like cell towers. You couldn't go out of range. If you go out of range, that god doesn't work anymore. It does not make any sense. This is what even God says in a lot of, like in Isaiah, and a lot of the minor prophets, is like, these things are made out of wood and you carved them yourself. There's no breath in them. They can't help you. It's a waste of your time. And he even walks through like how they're made in Isaiah. Like, man carves the wood, yeah. And then you get a blacksmith to like overlay it with some metal. And then it's a god. But the other part of that wood is burnt for like food, like campfires and stuff. Like, does this make any sense? This is a problem Israel struggled with. And the idea was because it was a sense of instant gratification. And this is what we were talking about in the last chapter, is delaying that sense of gratification. Casting your bread out on the waters, it'll return to you after many days. That's how we started the first verse of last chapter, chapter 11. And he's saying, you have to have a sense of delayed gratification. You can't be so focused on the here and now and what I want to accomplish right now that you lose sight of the future and that you lose sight of what's wise. So in penning all this down to give us the answer to, like, what's the secret to happiness? What's the meaning of life? What's the point? In a word, it would be wait. Patience. Everything in its time, nothing before its time. Everything according to God's timeline, none of it according to yours. That's the point. If you have patience and you can wait for God. And when God moves, move with him. But don't get so focused on the here and now that you're chasing after false gods that promise you these fake promises of, fortune and blessing and abundance right now. So much so that leads you away from your creator, who Solomon says you need to remember, your creator, because Solomon lived that life and he forgot his creator. We talked about this before too. He had 1,000 women in a harem. It's like 700 wives, 300 concubines. And one of them led him away from his God, right? Because there's accounts in the Bible of him sacrificing to Moloch and worshiping false gods. And to take the wisest man who ever lived and convince him to reject his God. Solomon said that was worse than dying. So now we're talking about old age. And Solomon is saying here that man goes to his eternal home, right? And the mourners go about the streets. They would literally hire wailers, right? Mourners to go and cry and wail and squeal in the streets to get everyone's attention and to kind of rile up the people who should be mourning to actually mourn for people. But the point he's saying is that all of that happens because man is going to his eternal home, which means there is an eternal home you are going to go to. And this is the first time he's actually kind of crossing this bridge and telling us this. It's the first time that we see him saying that you're going to have an eternity that you should be worried and concerned about right now. Remember, not living just for the moment, but thinking ahead. That's wisdom summed up. Think ahead. Think through it. Just think about it for a second. I tell people that all the time. Just stop. Think. Many people stop to think, never start again. Stop. Start thinking. In verse 6, he says, before, remember your Creator, before the silver cord is snapped. This silver cord, they would literally refer to your life as a silver strand, a silver cord. What ties your soul to your body, this idea of a silver cord. He said, before that is snapped, and you no longer are with your body, right? He says, before that happens, remember your Creator. Before the silver cord is snapped, or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher is shattered at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern. Again, referring to the body, but also, I find it interesting that he points to this idea of a silver cord, a golden bowl. What we would think of with the majority of like luxury and wealth and abundance, things of, riches, silver and gold. He's saying there's going to come a point where the silver cord snaps, and so wealth can't sustain you. There's going to come a point where the golden bowl breaks. What was the golden bowl used for? Golden bowls, literally what they were referring to here, the golden bowls were ceremonial vessels. So they would literally go down and carry the water, the living water. During their sacrifices, they would go and get living water, which meant running water, right? It was water that was good to drink, potable water, versus stagnant water, which that'll kill you. Don't drink that. Living water is water that runs, like a spring. They would go and carry that living water in golden bowls for their sacrifices and their offerings. And this is the same thing that Jesus said when he met the woman at the well, and he said that I am the living water. Whoever drinks of me will never thirst again. So there comes a point where the golden bowl shatters, and religion can't sustain you. The rituals can't sustain you. The silver riches aren't going to help you. And it doesn't get any better for the people who are poor, because when he's saying, even then, he lists that too, in saying the pitcher is shattered at the fountain. Even the earthen vessels, right? These regular, everyday clay pots shatter. Where do they shatter? At the fountain. So even your everyday hard, like I'll just work harder and grunt my way through it. He's like, there comes a point where that shatters, and it'll shatter at the fountain when you're trying to draw more water to sustain yourself. And then even then, the wheel breaks at the cistern, at the well. The wheel that they would use to raise up water. He's like, there will come a point where your riches don't sustain you. Your religion doesn't sustain you, and it breaks. Your work ethic breaks, and it can't sustain you. And even the mechanism, whatever it is, whatever your wheel is that you use to draw water out of the well, whatever it is you're drawing to sustain you, it breaks. At some point, all of it breaks. And at that point, there's nothing left for you to do. There's no more hope. There's no more ability. There's no second chance for you to then start thinking about your Creator. Think about your Creator in your youth, while you still have a work ethic, while you still have a life strand, while you still have the means to draw water, living water from the well. He says, think about it early, because there will come a point where it's too late and all that's broken and you can't repair it, because man's going to his eternal home. You've died. Once that happens, it's too late. The matter is settled. You made your decision at one point whether to accept or reject Yeshua, Jesus. And if you've rejected him, When it's broken, there's nothing that's going to bring that living water out of the well for you. When your life is over, there's nothing that's going to change it. So make your decision now while you're young and you still have the mental faculties to do so. And that's assuming you even make it to old age. Many don't. So he goes on here saying in verse 7, "And the dust returns to the earth as it was. And the spirit returns to the God who gave it." Right? To God who gave it. From dust you came, to dust you shall return. Adam was formed out of the clay of the earth before God breathed into him the breath of life, the ruach. And he's saying there comes a point where all that breaks, your body returns to the dust. Same as it came out of the dust, it will return to the dust. And what's either a good thing, and if you're a believer and you look forward to this, that's great. But if you're not, this is the terrifying part. The spirit returns to the God who gave it, right? Spirit returns to the Creator. For those who have a relationship with God, when that day happens, it's a going home. It's a rejoicing day, right? I've heard many people refer to those like funerals as going home parties. And I love the way they do this in a lot of like African countries, right? Like in Ghana, a friend of mine was telling me like the way they do their funerals, he had to go back for a funeral and they take like 2 months in between somebody dying and actually holding the funeral. And the whole point of that was so that everyone can get enough money together and make travel arrangements and get everything in. And it's huge. It's a huge event. And everyone, it's a party for like the whole town. It's this big thing, this big celebration. It's like a going home party, right? Celebrating another one going home. Because man is returning to his eternal home. God gave him that spirit, right? God put the spirit in the body. The body returns to the dust, but the spirit will return to the God who created it, to God. And if you don't make the decision to remember your Creator when you're young, it's a terrifying moment. But if you acknowledge who He is while you still have the chance, and you allow Him to be your personal Lord and Savior, right? This idea, and we say like the sinner's prayer, but sinner's prayer occurs nowhere in the Bible. That was something somebody made up. I can't remember the guy's name who made it up in like the 1850s. And this was where we get the idea of like, I say the sinner's prayer and I'm saved. That's not biblical. That's not actually anywhere in the Bible. What you'll see in the Bible is the Ethiopian eunuch, right? Does this where he's trying to understand it. And Peter goes to him and he's like, do you understand what you're reading? He's like, how can I understand it unless somebody explains it to me? So he explains it and they discuss it. And they have a conversation about who Jesus is. And then he says, okay, what must I do to be saved? And he says, repent and be baptized, right? So repent means to turn around, stop doing what you're doing and do things differently, which means change how you're approaching life, right? And then baptism, literally be baptized, right? It was this outward showing of what took place on the inside, this change. And then that's it. That was literally it. And then you see later on in like Romans, right, where Paul goes on explaining it to the Romans, that if you would literally just by mouth, confession is made unto salvation, right? If you believe that Jesus is the Son of God and Jesus died on the cross for your sins, died and rose again 3 days later. If you believe, if you call upon His name, you will be saved. That's what the Bible says. So should it start with a conversation? Absolutely. You can't start a relationship without communicating. In order for you to start a relationship with God, it starts by communicating, and that starts by prayer. So if you are in a point where you recognize you need to start developing that relationship with your Creator, I suggest you start with a prayer today and have that conversation. Confessing, repenting, changing. and believing, putting your faith and trust in Jesus to get you to heaven, because you're never going to earn your way there. You can't earn your way to hell. You can't earn your way to heaven. You can't earn your way to hell because you're already destined to go there if somebody doesn't save you. And the only person who can save you is Jesus, right? Yeshua, the Son of God, Christ. If you put your faith and trust in him, this will be a joyful day when you go home. But God is just. God is fair. So God's not going to force something on you you don't want. If you don't want a relationship with him now, you won't have a relationship with him when the Spirit returns to the Creator, to God. So it's an eternity without him. That's what hell is an eternity of separation from God. And it wasn't made for you. It wasn't made for me. It was made for the devil and his angels, the ones who rebelled against him. You're going to be an unwelcome guest there. If you want an eternity spent in relationship with the God who made you, it starts now. It does not start after you die. It starts now. So Solomon says it again. He says this famous line in verse 8, "Vanity of vanity, says the preacher, all is vanity." Everything's useless. Everything is worthless. For the man who had it all and lived it all, he's saying everything that you can get here is worthless. It's not going to fill that void that you have. That God-shaped hole that each one of us has, that we're born with, right? We spend a lifetime seeking, trying to fill with everything else. And nothing fills that void, because that void is meant to be filled by God and God alone. And he says, besides, verse 9, besides being wise, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs with great care. So we're kind of ending this chapter, this book, and we end it with this important point. Besides being wise, the preacher also taught the people knowledge. And this is where I feel like somewhere we went wrong. We went rogue as a church, and preachers, we got our jobs confused. And we thought the job was to condemn the people from the pulpit, condemn groups, condemn behaviors, rebuke them, and just scold them and preach hate. Literally, what Jesus commanded us to do was to love one another. And by this, people will know that you're my disciples if you have love one for another. When we were sent to go and preach the gospel, which means good news, not bad news. It's good news. You don't have to die and go to hell or an eternity of separation from God. There's good news. Jesus already died and paid the price for you. He says, you are to go and teach. Literally, besides being wise, the preacher also taught the people knowledge. And somewhere along the way, we've stopped doing this. We stopped being concerned about teaching the people true knowledge and an understanding of what's written in the scriptures in the book. And instead, it's 3 great talking points on every sermon's the same, and it follows a very specific format, and it's very ritualistic, very, very religious, and exactly the thing that Jesus came to destroy was the idea of religiosity, right? Just religion for the sake of religion, and instead form a relationship, because he never wanted sacrifices. He said, literally, he said, like, if you would have told the Pharisees, he's like, if you would have, read, have you not read? If you would have known what this meant, that I desire mercy or love, right? And not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. And we have turned into the Pharisees of today, the American church. This is what we do. It's sad, but that's the state of things. But he's saying that the preacher, besides being wise, right, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs with great care. How many preachers do you see that do that today, who actually weigh and study and are cautious about how they arrange their words with great care for the purpose of teaching people? And the preacher sought to find words of delight. Verse 10, the preacher sought to find words of delight, and uprightly he wrote words of truth. So not just preaching whatever to please the people. I'm not saying that. But he does say that the wisest preacher who ever lived, he went on to say that he taught people. And in it, you have to teach the people you're leading. If you're not teaching the people you're leading, you're not leading them. And if you're not cautious about how you arrange your words and making sure that you're choosing words that delight, that inspire, that uplift, that edify one another, you're not a preacher of the gospel. You're not a preacher of the good news. You may be preaching something, and you may be preaching for a God, but it is not the God of Israel. It is not the God of the Bible, and it is not Jesus Christ, because you're doing it your way, not the way he asked you to do it. Verse 11 says, the words of the wise are like goads. Like goads, the sticks they use to poke oxen in like the back, legs to keep them going or steer them. He says, the preacher sought to find words of delight, and uprightly he wrote words of truth. The words of the wise are like goads, and like nails firmly fixed are the collected sayings. Like nails firmly fixed. What you say shouldn't change. And what you say when you're leading people should be something that they can lean back on and say, like, yes, I have a point. What you're saying has a point. Like a nail, it is pointed, it is durable, and it is fixed. And you're not going to waver on it. They are given by one shepherd. So these wise words that you're putting out there, that you're teaching other people, they should be the wise words given by one shepherd. And that one shepherd should be God, right? That should be Jesus. If it's anyone else, it's not the God of the Bible. And you're not doing it the way God told you to do it. And what you're doing concerns me. This is why I got sick and tired and fed up with church. Hence, fed up church. The garbage that comes out of most pulpits today has nothing to do with the Bible. It's political. It's based on tradition, the traditions of men. As Jesus said, they teach for commandments, the traditions of men. And they teach for doctrine, the commandments of men was literally what he said. And he was quoting Isaiah when it was said in Isaiah 2. This is not a new problem. It's an old problem. It's a very old problem. All the way back to the beginning. When words start getting twisted around, people start misapplying things, and that kills people, right? It's how death entered mankind with Adam and the serpent and Eve, this whole thing. Anyway, verse 12, he says, my son, beware of anything beyond these. Of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. Of anything beyond this, right? Of anything beyond what's been given to you. Be cautious. Beware. It's not good. You can study and write books on everything until the end of time. And all that's going to do is exhaust you. And you'll get to the end of it and go, what was the point? Kind of like Solomon did. He said, I have taught people. I've arranged these sayings, these proverbs, and these instructions, and what I've learned with great care. Anything beyond what has been written, be careful about. If people start preaching things that are contrary to the actual Bible, what's written here, walk away. I understand that may be your church. That may be a church you're in. It was for me. I was in a church like that too. Started preaching crap that was not in the Bible. I have no time for it. Crap you're just making up. Your hair has to be cut a certain way. You can't do this, can't do that, can't do this. That's ungodly. Have you read the book? Very clearly not. I'm done. Bye. Read the book. So verse 13, he says, the end of the matter, all has been heard. Right? What's the end of the matter? How did he start this? Vanity of vanities, all is vanity, right? If everything's meaningless and pointless, what's the point? He said, okay, the end of the matter, after everything's been heard, from an under the sun premise of everything he can see, the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments. For this is the whole duty of man. That's the point. Why were we created? To glorify God. To be in companionship, in relationship with God. So everything he's lived, every experience he's had, and everything he has learned has taught him. It all comes down to fear God and keep his commandments. This is the whole duty of man. Fear God, yes, it means like having like a fear, but it's also it means a respect, a reverence, an appreciation for who he is. And remember that he is your creator. And one day you're going to return to him. And when you do, will it be a good day? Or is that going to be a terrifying day? For many people, it'll be a terrifying day. I look forward to that day of meeting my Maker. Now, there are several things I don't want to have to give an account for. And he says right here, for God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. And there's many things all of us have done. There's many things we've all lived, all experiences, and Solomon included, where there are things he does not want to have to recount or discuss, I'm sure. But it comes down to every work, every deed will be brought into judgment, meaning justice, whether it was good or evil, whether it was good or harmful. That's a conversation we're all going to have. You might want to start getting prepared for it now and start building that relationship with him now. Because whether you believe in him or not, you'll have the conversation. What happens after that, it's up to you now. Put your faith and trust in Christ today. I love you guys. And if it's your first time here, like and share and subscribe or whatever. Click the notification bell thingy. I appreciate it. But if you have never put your faith and trust in God and you don't know how to pray, I'm going to take a moment, and I don't normally do this on here as we do a Bible study, but it's relevant and it applies here. If you've never put your faith and trust in God, in Christ, in Jesus, it starts with a communication. It starts with a conversation. In order to have a relationship with somebody, you have to communicate. And I tell that to many people, and they go, well, I don't know how to pray. Like, I don't know any prayers. There's no such thing as knowing prayers. Catholics came up with that to make it sound fancy, and that's why they recite it in Latin half the time. But that's not the point. The point is to have a conversation with your Maker, with your Creator, with God. If you've never had that conversation, you've never had a relationship like that with God, so you don't know how to pray, I'll help you kind of word through a prayer the way that I pray when I'm having a conversation with my Creator, with my God, with my Maker, which is many times a day. If you're ready to put your faith and trust in Christ, today's the day. So follow along. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for your Son dying on the cross for my sins. I understand I'm a sinner. I understand I deserve justice, and that results in me going to hell. I understand that. But I understand that your Son, Jesus, came and died on the cross for me and rose again after 3 days. And I ask Jesus to come into my life and be my personal Lord and Savior. I make him Lord of my life in every aspect of my life, and I will spend the rest of my life submitting to his authority and his guidance and his counsel. I love you and I thank you, and God, please forgive me. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Something like that. Something simple. It's just a conversation. Have a conversation with your Father. I love you guys. We'll pick up next week with a new book. If you have anything you're interested in, let me know in the comments, and we'll start digging into it. But for now, I'm going to sign off, and I'll catch you guys next week.